let's even maybe start with the word spiritual. I think you described it in what you just said about something greater than consensus reality,
Hmm.
which might include, like you said, grace, kindness, generosity. So, is there anything else you can say about exactly how you define the word spiritual or spirituality?
So in my book, I might reference my books just
Yes,
because
please
I
do.
can. And so I wrote a book called Cultivating Spirituality in Children,
Mm.
101 Ways to Make Our Children, Support Our Children into Soaring. And I did a really good description of spirituality in that. And the idea of that book was, hey, as parents, we need to integrate and know what and experience and live these concepts in order to bring about greater degrees of spirituality in our children. For me, spirituality is about living beyond what we know to be true, living beyond fear-based, factual consensus reality. So I talk about the paradigm shifts, which are paradigm shift. We have to have a paradigm that's greater than what we're living in. And so many of us know that we have that, but we don't actually engage in it in an intelligent way.
Mm.
That makes sense. In an engaged way. We go to church or we do meditation, but in terms of really focusing on and expanding that relationship with our spirit self, most of us ignore that. So I think of sexuality, sensuality, spirituality. It's a quality of relationship with ourself,
Mm.
our higher self that we, in a sense, know exists, but again, we take for granted or we ignore it to a greater degree.
Mm.
So I think those who are, I think spiritual intelligence is cultivating that relationship, that openness, that expansion to greater and greater degrees of knowing from that divine, what I call divine or universal source of all that is, the isness, the oneness of that. Now we can do that in terms of seeing universal intelligence, but then there's that the question, and I don't really care if it's divine intelligence, sacred developed intelligence, or just intelligence. It doesn't matter. But my experience is that of expanding our awareness to include more and more of that.
Mm.
um, I started last a couple. I've read The Alchemist a couple of times, and I was been drawn to go back to the Alchemist, and I'm listening to it on Audibles, and it is so in alignment with that, the knowingness of the wisdom of the soul of the earth, the soul of the universe, the soul of all of us, and the oneness of that. The whole book is about that. And that's like, yes, 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 that's what I'm talking about, is the knowing and living into the knowingness of life,
Mm.
the big L life.
Yes. So, two questions come to mind in response to that very eloquent explanation. One is you mentioned the higher self,
Hmm.
and you also mentioned all that is, the universal intelligence. To you, is there a distinction between the higher self and the universal intelligence, all that is, or is the higher self that?
I think it's the both and it's one of those, again, tricky places that doesn't need to be argued. It's just how people see it. um, and so for instance, when I've got, in my perspective, I have angels and I have guides and I have a higher wisdom self, and I may have, in the Christian tradition, there's a Holy Spirit, and then there's Jesus, and there's universal, we'll call it God. And so there's levels of vibration. And so me in this body, I've been working at elevating my level of consciousness and my level of vibration, which then makes me more aware of and attuned to other aspects of reality. I perhaps seeing elementals. Some people can see elementals or fairies or trees talking, or those kinds of concepts, or intuitiveness. Creativity is something that is in essence who we are as creative.
Mhm.
Um, so as I raise my vibration in elevation and consciousness, then I have more and more access to these, I think, call them higher or greater levels of universal oneness.
Hmm.
So for me, it's the same, and there may be, from what other people say, it's like, oh yeah, that the Holy Spirit, or in the Kabbalah, you've got the Kabbalah, the Holy Spirit, which is in a sense the guy that'll talk to the higher ones for you, because it's said that I don't necessarily have the capacity to speak to or communicate with those higher realms. So it doesn't matter to me what somebody believes or what's true. It doesn't, but it's just that I think I can relate to my higher self.
I see. That's
And
really interesting.
I could kind of sort of relate to a Holy Spirit part. I mean, it was part of my upbringing as a Catholic, but very different way, very different way. And then the rest of it is, as I'm, like I said, elevating, then I have greater capacity to of a sense of knowing in that, and reaching out myself that way.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
It does. I'm really just processing that. It's really interesting. Something that just stood out to me is the acknowledgement of a plurality of spiritual practices and traditions and perspectives, and how spiritual intelligence can express itself through any of those different approaches to spirituality, whatever exactly the belief system is. Generally, it's true that all of these so-called spiritual perspectives are similar in the way that they are focused on something greater than
Mm-hmm.
the mortal body, I suppose you
That's
could
right.
say.
That's right.
And so that's beautiful to me, that spiritual intelligence can basically kind of fuel whatever the person's spirituality is, however different it may look from other people's spirituality. That's interesting, and it's very inclusive, and that seems true to me.
Thank you. If you think about all religions or spiritual traditions started with somebody who had an experience of knowing. This experience that said, I had this experience and I have this knowing that occurred because of that.
Mm,
And because of that, these different paths were evolved towards this greater knowing
mm,
of something divine. And
yes.
it's just, that's what's true. And then the dogma of religious practices, or the religious rules and regulations and dogmas that constrain and constrict
Hmm.
one's ability. So for instance, growing up Catholic, we weren't allowed to talk to God.
Mm,
We prayed, but we weren't allowed to have that one-on-one conversation. We had to talk through a priest. The priest was that intercessory person thing. So
mm,
it was like, at one point I went, what's the point of that? Why, I don't want to go to confession and tell this guy. I'm going to tell God. What's the point, right? So I
right.
started having that, just
Mm,
because I decided that was what I wanted to do. And the point where we can defer to no one, my spiritual, like what we're having this conversation, a lot of people might argue or say, she doesn't know what she's talking about or whatever, and it doesn't matter to me. This is my experience, and this is the way that I frame my truth so that it's mine, how I hold it. And I'm totally open to supporting and empowering people to discover and find theirs. That's why I do the work I do.
mm. And I think that highlights maybe the distinction between spirituality and religion. Although religion can be full of spirituality, spirituality can be separated from religion.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps this is one of the signature ways in which it can separate itself, is in the way that it is very personal,
Mm-hmm.
and it can be interpreted and designed however it's meaningful to the individual.
That's right.